Continuing the arthropod chapter, we're going to get into the two major subgroups, the subphyla. The two scorpions sitting on a shoe. There I was, asleep in this little cave here, when suddenly I was attacked by this hideous thing with 5 heads. If you know anybody that lives out New Mexico, Arizona, that area of the country, you don't just stick your foot in your shoe. Pick the shoe up and you make sure that these guys are not in there, because that does happen. And it's this scorpion. The scorpions, like a lot of stinging arthropods, some of them are just nasty, annoying things like being stung by a bee. Some people develop allergies to them, and some of them have particularly nasty venom, like a black widow spider, or there are some scorpions out west that are pretty dangerous. They're not very big, but they pack quite a punch. Whereas the black guys that you see often in people's tanks, we used to have one in the lab here. I put what's left of him out for the classification lab. They're pretty easy to get along with, and their sting, if they do happen to sting you, is probably in the neighborhood of what a wasp would feel like. These guys are in the first of the two subphyla. The subphyla are named based on mouth parts. You have the Chelicerates, which is this group, which I'm going to write in a second, and the mandibulates. The mandibulates are the holdover parts of the annelids, the segmented worms. They have mandibles and antennae. These guys do not. Do little spiders on a slide, and it says, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. A little dark. Not too surprisingly, there's a lot of cartoons about arthropods. It's a letter from Julio in America. His banana bunch arrived safely, and he's living in the back room of some grocery store. Is that they do pack tarantulas up sometimes with bananas, and sometimes other nasty things that came out of the rainforest, but typically not. Tarantulas, although they look fairly nasty, don't tend to have particularly nasty venom. But again, it is possible to develop allergies. The main molecules in arthropod venom tends to be proteins. And proteins are the sort of molecules that we can develop allergies to. You wouldn't develop an allergy to every single poison you might get exposed to. If a poison is particularly small molecule or atoms or ions, you're not going to actually develop an allergy to it. You may develop a resistance, a capability of metabolizing it, but that's kind of rare. The Hansen's decision to buy an attack spider finally paid off. So the Chelicerates typically have 10 set of legs, although very often the front pair are modified and they don't walk with them. In fact, most of the time that's true. And they have these kind of bitey, chewy kind of mouth parts, the Chelicerae. They don't have antennae. You never see them with wings. They're not insects. Insects are in the other subphylum. And there's really 2 major groups inside the Chelicerates. The horseshoe crabs, which are these guys. This is one that I brought back from Maine. It was dead. So I scarfed it up from the surf zone, which is where they live. get this in the light. A lot of legs. Now they have 10 sets of legs. They don't have, the front set isn't particularly modified. And so if you flip them over, they suddenly look like the things from Alien that jump on your face. Relatively benign is that I expect they could pinch you. You know, they've got little pinchers on the ends of their feet, and they've got little manipulators up front that are pinchers. But typically they're pretty easy to get along with. This one is a fairly big one. And this is an example of what they call a living fossil. Is you can go back 500 million years and find fossils that look just like this. And we've talked about that before, is that animals or plants or anything really, if they live in a part of the environment that doesn't really change much, and the surf zone around the continents has moved around as the continents have moved around, but it hasn't really changed its nature since the snowball Earth. And these guys are very good at crawling around on the bottom and just picking stuff up and browsing. And they got to that form a long, long time ago, and they've kind of settled in it. And as long as their conditions haven't changed, they haven't really needed to. And in fact, they have evolved not to evolve. They actually, instead of producing a lot of diversity, they don't tend to be particularly different. And if you try to mutate them, they fix their DNA much better than we do. They do not produce mutations at the rate that other animals whose ancestry goes into condition changes does. So they're kind of neat that way. They also have this weird element, it's not really an element, it's a protein in their blood that's basically an antibacterial material. And somewhere in Maryland, I think, they have a whole lab where they basically pull blood out of these guys every day. Somebody goes out and collects a whole bunch of them from the surf zone, brings them into the lab. They take some blue blood out of them. Their oxygen carrier is bluish, based on copper. And for a long time, it was a very quick test of if you had a blood infection. They could take a little bit of plasma and mix it with the blood and get clumps, because that's what it does to bacteria. It clumps them together so that they can't infect the body. They're still doing that. The blood is still fairly good for certain types of tests. Probably not a lot of fun for them, but they put them back. Then they get, they don't kill them. They just really inconvenience them for the day. Now the rest of the Chelicerates are all lumped together in a group most of you have heard of. The arachnids. And you go, oh yeah, those are the spiders. Well, the spiders are in this group, but they're not the only arthropods in the arachnids. There's a whole bunch of them and a whole bunch of other things that you've heard of. In this case, their front set of legs are modified. They can be pinchers, they can be feelers, what they call pedipalps. They can actually be used to transfer sperm if you're a male, transfer a sperm packet into the female. There's a lot of modifications of the front set of legs in the arachnids. So this does include the spiders. Also the harvestmen, around here very often called the daddy longlegs. Daddy longlegs are superficially look like spiders. People think they're spiders. They don't make webs. They're built a little bit differently than spiders. They are predatory. They do eat very small arthropods and other kinds of animals. They do bite them, and they have a venom that they incapacitate them with. But their fangs are extremely short, so if you handle a daddy longlegs, even if it bit you, you wouldn't be able to feel it, and the venom wouldn't get into you. If you read about them, there's a lot of stuff out there about animals that is wrong. And it either goes back to a misinterpretation of long ago when it's made it into the books and nobody's really been able to change it, or it's part of the mythology. And okay, if you look up stuff about daddy longlegs, you're likely to run into, they have the most potent venom of any of the animals. Their venom is the most poisonous of all the venoms. And the people that work on these guys go, we have no idea where that came from. They got fairly decent, nasty venom, but it isn't particularly nastier or more potent than venom in a lot of the other arachnids or a lot of the other arthropods in general. But everybody's read that somewhere. And I'm always getting asked about it if you're a harvestman researcher, of which there's not a lot. But they don't really know where the original story came from. These guys, incidentally, their second set of legs, they have the pedipalps, which are not really legs anymore, and then they have a set of legs, and then you'll notice they have two very long legs. They're essentially blind, and they work their way through the world with those sets of legs, almost like a blind person with a cane. They feel their way through the world. And if something happens to one or both of those legs, they basically have become incapacitated. They're not going to be able to move around much or feed themselves. So be careful when you're handling daddy long legs. Scorpions. Scorpions is a fairly big and pretty diverse group. Spiders, not a lot. I mean, there's a lot of different species of spiders, but they're all somewhat similar. They don't live all the same way. They don't all build webs. They do lay webs down behind them, which allows them to kind of feel things around their den, because they have this network of webs laid out there. It does help if they're up on something and they drop off, the web will catch them, like a mountain climber putting a python in and having the rope attached to it. And they're the only ones that produce webs. But other than, they're relatively similar to one another. Scorpions, lots and lots of different types of scorpions. They don't all have the tail with the stinger on it. Some of them get fairly large, some varieties. Some of them get very small. Pseudo scorpions and book scorpions can be very tiny, very flat kind of things. They literally live between the pages of books. Lots and lots of different types of scorpions out there. Ticks. Ticks are parasites. They attach to larger animals and they suck their blood. And they will pick up potentially disease organisms from one host and transfer them to another. That's what happens with Lyme disease and babesiosis, and there's a number of different tick-borne diseases that you can catch in the United States. Around here it's primarily Lyme disease. Weird thing about Lyme disease is that it's spread through the saliva, kind of like what mosquitoes do with malaria, except it isn't in the salivary glands all the time. So when a tick kind of shoves its mouth parts into your skin and it has to spit out to keep the blood from clotting, the Lyme disease bacteria are not in there immediately. Once the tick starts to feed, it gets into the saliva and then gets into your body. So typically, if a tick has not been attached to you for more than a day, then you probably have not picked up enough bacteria to get a dose of Lyme disease. Some of the other things like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, I don't believe they work the same way. But around here, it's Lyme disease that people worry about. And you'll hear, oh, you got to worry about ticks all year round. That's not really true. They can be active when it's fairly cold, almost down to freezing. But when they suck blood, their bodies have to expand. And so their exoskeleton is not as waterproof, not as sealed as other exoskeletons that have a cuticle that's fairly waterproof on them because it's set in place. And so ticks are more sensitive to dryness than they are to temperature. And if the relative humidity drops below a certain level, which it does in the fall and winter and early spring, they're not out and about, because if they get off the ground where it's somewhat moister, up where they actually sit on the edges of grass and sticks and stuff and do what's called questing. They sit there with their legs out waiting for something to go by that they can grab onto. if they did that and it was too dry, they would dry to death. So there's certain times a year where you don't really have to worry about ticks. And then the mites. When we did the microscope and I showed the ant antennae with the bristles and the little thing attached to it, that was a mite. Mites tend to be extremely small. It's a really varied group. A lot of them are free living, just live out in the environment. There's mites around here that live in the water. If you see a tiny little red thing zipping around, climbing on the plants and kind of swimming, that's a type of mite. There are mites that are parasitic, that live on things. Dust mites. People that are allergic to dust are actually allergic to proteins in the fecal material of dust mites. They live in very dry things, and they're very small, and their fecal particles are even smaller. And so particles of dust often have those on them, and people, breathe them in and react to the proteins that are in the. You probably, if you have a dust allergy or you breathe, you're probably not too crazy about hearing about this, but it's my job to make you uncomfortable sometimes with this stuff. And these are the major groups of the chelicerates. And then the very last group, we may not even be able to get to fit. Even if we were doing it separately, may not be able to get it to fit all on one video.